and welcome back to my channel, where I'm going to cover the Sorcerer's Divine Soul class specialization from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, providing a brief description of the subclass, as well as explain and set up the various features gained. A Divine Soul class character is one who has been blessed by some god for any number of reasons, and the source material shows you a few examples you can use to work with, or use to come up with your own concept around them, or even come up with your own period. It's best to work with the DM to see what you can come up with that aligns with the concept of the world the campaign will be taking place in, but overall it should not be that big of an issue, depending on how much detail you'd like to go into. These kinds of characters, however, can become the targets of religious organizations who feel your connection to a given god defeats their need to exist, and might not like your direct link to the god that gave you your character's powers. As such, parties who include this class of character will potentially run into a few more encounters than normal, especially when near regions that might have religious zealots about. Sorcerers have to select their class specialization at level 1, which is why I don't have a character on the screen here, because their power is derived by their class specialization, rather than just simply being a sorcerer. As such, I'll have to quickly create a basic level 1 character and then bring you back when I'm about to apply the class specialization during the character creation process. So give me a moment, I'll be right back. So at this point, I have progressed far enough that I'm now required to select the class specialization. I simply got this prompt the minute I hit this button here for Sorcerer. So the one I want to choose in this particular case is Divine Soul. The first feature your character will gain is called Divine Magic, and this sets the affinity of your magic to your character as well as grants you access to clerical spells in addition to sorcerer spells when choosing spells for your character. If you choose to take a clerical spell, then that spell for all intents and purposes is a sorcerer spell, so we will need to ensure our spell groups are set appropriately to handle this, but we should not have to make any adjustments unless we want to keep those spells separate, and I'll be sure to show you what I mean. In relation to the spell affinity, there are 5 to choose from, and they are specifically down here at the bottom of the actual Divine Magic information sheet. And this sets the nature, if you will, of your power. The available affinities are good, evil, law, chaos, and neutrality. With each affinity, your character is granted an additional spell, but you can only choose one affinity for your power. And the table shown in the information sheet explains which spell you will gain, and this spell will not count against your total sorcerer spells that your character can know, as it's meant to be in addition to them. The good news here is that the spell can also be changed out, at the time that your character can normally change out a known spell, but if you choose to do so, you must select another clerical spell with which to replace it with. So the first thing I'm going to do is handle the spell affinity group, because that's going to be slightly different, and I want to keep those separate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find, in this case, I'm going to choose affinity of good, and generally when I do that, I do this. So I will put into the actual description of the Divine Magic reference here on your abilities page what the affinity is that you've chosen. So just let me keep it separate. I'm going to look for spells. So in this case, I'm going to go for Cure Wounds. And it doesn't really matter which one you pull from, but I generally prefer that you pull from the first source book it was released in, which in this case is the Player's Handbook. And what that will do is that will drop that initially into your level 1 spells. And it should, for all intents and purposes, set it up so that it works with your existing actual sorcerer capabilities here. And that's fine. What I actually want to do is move this into a new group called Spell Affinity. And I'm also going to put in brackets the affinity I've chosen. I will then ensure that any spell that gets thrown into this particular group, because if I do decide to change it out at some point in the future, I will want to make sure this is set up. And all of the sorcerer's spellcasting capabilities use charisma. And you can check that by going to your spellcasting feature, looking for spellcasting ability, which is further on down the table here, and generally you will see it right away within your actual spell save. That's a similar thing, but if you really want to read through the description, it's generally included in the description as well. With this set up, I can now drag any spell that comes from the clerical source into this area, and it will automatically make use of charisma. I won't have to worry about it trying to use wisdom, which is typically the default for a cleric. Now, before I move on, I also need to make sure that this gets changed to a spell group. And that's important because this is going to be treated like a spell. If you run out of spell slots, this does go away in the sense that you lose the ability to cast it. You must have active spell slots to be able to cast these spells. Even though they don't count against your known spells list, you still need the slot there to be able to cast it. Finally, I'm going to go through and prepare it. And that's just to ensure that when I'm in the actions and combat and actions mode here, I should say, this spell will be available. And when I actually go through and cast it, and what I mean by that is that I will use one of these spell slot pips here. And if I use all of them, all of the spells go away with the exception of cantrips. Now, if you had chosen to actually include level 1 spells that are from the clerical group as well, I highly recommend you use the same process and create a group called clerical spells as opposed to just spells, and throw all of those clerical spells into there. Again, it's just to enforce that your character will be able to make use of your charisma modifier for any spells that require typically a wisdom-based modifier. So that's the reason why you want to do that. I'm not going to show that on screen because essentially I already did. All you have to do is just repeat that step. That way it keeps your actual spells from your sorcerer separate from your clerical spells, separate from your spell affinity spells. And I just want to make sure that these are also prepared. Now, you may have noticed that when I was in combat and actions here, these were still here. That is the case most of the time, but there are a handful of spells that seem to disappear for some reason whenever you're in there if they're not actually prepared. So that's the reason why I make sure that I go through and prepare them. Also at Sorcerer level 1, your character gains the Favored by the Gods feature that allows you to add 2d4 points to a saving throw or attack roll in the event of a failed save or a missed attack. These points would simply be added to an existing roll when it comes to a pen and paper based application. But for more automatic use of the Fantasy Grounds Unity features, it might make sense to activate the effect before you roll in the event that you are thinking you're going to miss or even have a bad saving throw. Additionally, you can only use this feature once before your character will be required to complete a short or long rest. So while this could help in a tight situation, it's not something you can overuse. So let's go ahead and set this up in our character's action sheet. The good news about features is you can drag and drop them anywheres on your actual action sheet. They don't drop into the spell groups, much like the way that spells do in relation to actual groups, like power groups. Not sure why that is, but it does make things a little bit more convenient because it means you don't have to minimize your spell groupings here consistently or all the time. Now, I'm going to create the Divine Soul class specialization group here, Divine Soul, and that will be added as part of that group. I'm then going to make sure that there's a new effect here. And what I want it to do is the following. I'm going to call it Favored by the Gods, semicolon, ATK, colon, 2d4, semicolon, SAVE, colon, 2d4. And this one effect will allow you to apply it to both your attack roll and your saving throw. It is only going to be for your own character, and it's going to expire on the next roll, so it's not going to sit around. So first, I'm going to make sure that I have the actual preparation set up, so that when we actually go through and use this, we have a little pip here that we can tick. Next, the way that this thing is going to work is as follows. I'm going to attack the vampire, but I have a sneaky suspicion based on all of the rolls that I've made throughout the course of the day so far that I'm going to roll badly. In this particular case, I'm going to add the effect in advance of me making the attack roll, and then I'm going to make the attack roll. What would be the odds that I would roll a 20 right then and there? Thank you, Fantasy Grounds. Anyway, so my scenario didn't play out the way I had thought. But the idea is that when you think you're going to get a very low roll, you'll want to make sure that you add this effect onto it. The same thing can be said when it comes to an actual saving throw. So if I wanted to go through and actually make a saving throw, what I would do is preload the effect, go ahead and make my Constitution say saving throw, for example, and then all of those points will get added together. Now, if you didn't want to use the automation features, what you can do is roll your saving throw as normal. See here, I now have a 2. And then make the decision to go ahead and use the feature and manually roll the dice. And you'll have to throw them into the chat box here. You can't just simply drop, like, for example, dice along here. They'll roll, but they won't count any value and apply it into your chat window here. So I had an initial value of 5. I can now add 6 additional points to it. Who knows, maybe an 11 is the correct value when it comes to the saving throw. Maybe it was a save versus 10. We don't know. But in any event, that is how this is going to work. The last thing that you will want to do when you do actually use the feature is simply click that so that it goes away. Now, I want that there because it's easier to set up additional items into the group when you can copy and paste this. So I don't want it to go away just yet. At Sorcerer level 6, your character will gain the Empowered Healing feature that allows you to re-roll a number of dice when you or an ally within 5 feet of you is casting anything that restores hit points to 1 or more creatures. By expending 1 sorcery point, your character can re-roll those dice, and the new total is what would get used for the healing. Though this is going to require some intervention from the DM in order to make it work the best. For example, let's say a party cleric is casting Cure Wounds, and is doing so using a level 4 spell slot. That means they will roll 4d6 dice, and that would result normally in the amount to be healed. But let's say 3 of the dice were a 2, and the last one was an 8. You can use your sorcery point to re-roll all of the dice that were a 2 or less in relation to this example, and the new values would be added to the 8 points that were left behind. Continuing our example, let's say that 2 of the re-rolled dice rolled a 7 and the third rolled a 1. All 3 of these new values would still be used, so your new totals are 2 times 7 plus 1 plus 8, for a total of 23 versus the original 14. The low values do not matter as to what they are. You could theoretically choose to re-roll all the dice even if they rolled a 7 on the initial values. There is no numerical limit as to how low the value needs to be before you can choose to force a re-roll, or how many of those dice you can actually go through and select for the re-roll. The only limitations are that it can only be done once per healing spell, and the new values must be used, and you can only do this once per turn. And what I mean, one healing spell, I don't mean that when John Doe casts healing, or Cure Wounds rather, on a particular character, that you can never ever re-roll the dice on that Cure Wounds spell again. That's not what I'm implying. What I mean is that when John Doe is casting that particular spell during that particular turn, you can only affect the dice for that one spell. You will not be able to affect any other healing spells that get cast for the rest of that particular turn. Fantasy Grounds Unity, however, does not really have a mechanism to handle this kind of thing, though it is possible to re-roll any die under a specific value at the time the roll is completed. And this might be the best way to do this, but there would need to be some coordination between the caster using the healing effect if you're not the one actually executing the casting. Additionally, the DM might have to intervene to correct any healing spells that had already been automatically applied by dropping the total of the lowest values that you chose to replace and adding the total of the new values that you managed to roll. Now, unfortunately, there isn't really an easy way to do this. However, there is a reroll capability. And the way this works is you type something into the chat window. And in this case, it can be either /die or /roll. It doesn't really much matter. Space 4d8 R2 if we're continuing our example. And what that means is that it will roll 4 die 8s, and anything under a 2, it will re-roll. So let's see if I can get something that will actually do that. So I got a 1 there and a 2, and you saw that it re-rolled a 3. This might actually be the best way that you can do this, is essentially coordinate with the player who's going to do the spell casting and say, hey, instead of you directly rolling that particular spell against a particular character, execute this call, and I'm going to say I'm automatically going to replace anything that is 4 or less. So by doing that, let's say again, this particular cleric is casting this as a level 4 spell slot. You could do /die space 48R4, and it will re-roll anything that is less than a 4 or under 4 and a 4. The problem is it keeps going, and we don't want that. That's the risk with this particular feature. And that is an example of where that just happened. So unfortunately, there really isn't an easy way to handle this. But let's ignore the fact that this one got re-rolled. And let's say that the 5 was always here to begin with. So instead of it rolling a 1 and a 5, it had rolled 2 5s to give us our 23 total. What can happen here is that the DM can usually use the control key and drag this number directly from the chat and apply it to a particular creature or character on the combat tracker. Generally, while you're holding down the control key, that would subtract damage that particular creature received, meaning it's a heal. Unfortunately, there is currently a bug that has not yet been resolved, so the DM is going to have to deal with this manually for the time being. But how do you go about handling sorcery points? Because this is a spell that you can spend a particular sorcery point. And I know that I covered sorcery points in my previous sorcerer-based videos, but I'm going to do this slightly differently because I've since learned that I think there is a better way to actually go about doing this. So the way I'm going to set this up is I'm going to drop this onto our action sheet here. I'm also going to modify the group. You can call it Fonts of Magic or Sorcery Points. For some reason, it's actually called Font of Magic here for the feature, but the Sorcery Point reference is in all of the actual features that make use of them. So I think it makes sense to keep it Sorcery Points. I'm then going to make a modification to the power group itself. I'm going to set it up to use Charisma as our ability score. And because we're level 9 and the number of sorcery points equals your level, I'm going to change that to a 9. That way we get a total of 9 uses, if you will, before we essentially run out of being able to cast this particular feature or make use of this particular feature. Now when I go ahead and set things up inside of the combat and actions mode, when I burn through all of the sorcery points, the ability to use any additional sorcery points goes away and it's automatic. You don't have the features that you could theoretically still use sorcery points for sitting there in your action sheet. The only way you can get them back is to complete a long rest, which will start to restore all of your sorcery points back. Therefore, your ability to use it again returns. So that's how this is going to work. And I set up the ability to Charisma because there may be our remaining 2 features might actually use that directly, and we'll want to ensure that we track that and set it up to use Charisma as the appropriate ability. At Sorcerer level 14, your character will gain the Otherworldly Wings feature that allows your character to manifest wings as a bonus action that will give you a flying speed of 30 feet. The wings will remain summoned until your character decides they are no longer needed, which will also take a bonus action to do. In addition, they can go away if the character has died or has otherwise become incapacitated. The appearance of the wings can be that of an eagle, bat, or dragonfly, depending on the affinity that your character has chosen. And this appearance cannot be otherwise changed unless you can somehow change your character's affinity, which I honestly am not sure if that's possible or not. I suppose you could theoretically use Tash's Cauldron of Everything's ability to change things about your character and thereby change your affinity, but that I think is going to be entirely up to the Dungeon Master as to whether they're going to allow that or not. Now, as this is primarily a role-playing and movement-based feature, there really isn't a need to go through and add this to our action sheet in any way, shape, or form. The final feature your character is going to acquire from the subclass is called Unearthly Recovery, and this happens at level 18. This feature allows you to make use of a bonus action to heal your own character a total of half your maximum hit points when your character, at the time of this particular feature is used, is less than half of their normal total hit points. For example, if your character has a normal total number of hit points of 50 hit points and you're at 24 hit points, you can use this feature. However, if your character is at 26 hit points, you cannot use this feature. This does have a usage limitation in that it can only be used once until your character completes a long rest before regaining any spent uses. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and add this to our action sheet, and we will want to ensure that we add this to the Divine Soul group for the purposes of tracking the total number of daily uses. And that's all we have to do to set that up, is once we've used it, we now need to complete a long rest in order to regain the use of that particular feature. The last thing you'll want to do is make sure that you have a method of quickly recovering those hit points. So what I'm going to do is quickly add a heal thing here. I'm going to pop this open and then switch this over to our main tab to get a total idea as to what our maximum number of our hit points is. In this particular case, this works out to be 46 hit points. So I'm going to create a new effect. I'm just going to put 46 hit points here, and that's it. Now, when I need to quickly heal myself, I can just go bing, and I've got those 46 hit points recovered. It should go without saying that as your character continues to level up through to level 20 and or gains any additional hit points through other methods or means, you'll want to make sure that you reevaluate this and make the adjustment as required. And that brings us to the point where we've completed everything we have to deal with this in relation to this particular character. And crossing the sorcerer with divine capabilities is an interesting concept because it allows the player to act as both the healer and the damage dealer in relation to spellcasting as long as the right spells are chosen. Now, some might argue that yes, the cleric has that capability as well. I'm not disagreeing. But it is also now possible that theoretically a sorcerer can actually cast divine magic in addition to their own sorcery magic, crossing both barriers of what was typically not something that you could possibly do in the past. However, as I've only seen a handful of sorcerers in use, I've not really gained enough experience with their subclasses to really determine if they are good or bad. But don't let that deter you on making use of this particular class. It does look like it could be fun to play and quite useful in a smaller party. However, this does bring us to the end of this video. I hope you found it useful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.
I wish to thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. I hope you found it informative and useful to familiarizing yourself with Fantasy Grounds in general, and that you had fun in the process. If you found the video useful and you liked the content of the particular video, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions specific to the topic covered by this particular video, or just have some comments in general, please feel free to post something in the comments section, and I will do my best to respond to any questions that are asked. Additionally, I do release content quite regularly, and it's generally specific to Fantasy Grounds or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons at this time. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe and click the notification bell to ensure that notification is sent to you when I release a new video.